Hi, welcome to all of you for this our third session of our this course. And I request to Sindhuji for to start the course. I request to all on the given email ID you can send your this homework or the assignment if you want. ये असाइनमेंट जो है ये आपके आप जो सीख रहे हैं जो कोर्स आप कर रहे हैं उसमें आपको अगर सही में रुचि है अगर आप सही में आगे बढ़ना चाहते हैं तो उसके लिए दिया हुआ एक वर्क है ऐसा समझ लीजिए इट्स फॉर आवर प्रैक्टिस नॉट एज अ स्टूडेंट्स एंड एज अ compulsion but request to you that if you will complete it you will get mastery in it. So thanks a lot, and Sindhuji, please start the session.
Sure, sir. Namaskar to all of you. I will share my presentation in a moment. Is it visible, sir?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Like always, we'll start with recap. Of course, in this session, we will look at fundamental aspects of conservation. And precisely, we are looking at three important aspects: authenticity and integration, or integrity, which are very important aspects in conservation. And then we look at aim of conservation. What is the purpose? What is it that we are going to conserve? And that decides the process. And then we look at another important aspect of conservation, ethics. So let's just have a quick recap from yesterday's session where we discussed conservation in ancient India. Here, we looked at concept of Jeernodharana. In ancient building traditions, renewed shell performs its function more efficiently. And then followed by wildlife conservation in early 3rd century, where Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka played a huge role. Kupyo Dakshiya, or forest head, and the document related to that, which spelled out wildlife conservation and measures. And in early 5th century, we also looked at Yagnavalkya Smriti, which prohibited felling of trees and also prescribed a severe punishment for such acts. And then we also looked at water conservation from Chola era, which played a huge role, and more than 100 inscriptions on temples in Tamil Nadu, which dealt exclusively with water management and their conservation. We also discussed in 12th century what steps were taken by Sri Ramanujacharya with water conservation, especially the example of Tondunuru, where he built that Tondunuru Lake, which is a picnic spot today, and also his activities of restoration of ancient ruins of temples. And then we also discussed conservation during and after British Raj, where we looked at V.P. Madhav Rao, who focused on conservation of forest, Mysore Diwan. And we also looked at the successor Diwan after V.P. Madhav Rao, Sir M. Vishweshwaraya, and his conservation both in Mysore and Hyderabad, where he advocated green lung spaces, dams which built not only to check the floods, but also to irrigate the entire land, and planning which focused on heritage conservation and reuse of heritage buildings. And then we also looked at a very interesting story of Bellavi Venkata Ramanappa in Bangalore, whose restoring efforts of temple ruins. And a very important lesson that we learned from him was that not only to conserve built heritage in our time, but also to ensure that it went into right hands for the future conservation. And then we moved on to understand certain antiquarian laws and acts and rules, certain legislations, both at central and civil legislations, legal statutory frameworks that we have for conservation. And when it comes to management of heritage, we looked at institutional setups like urban local bodies, civil societies, and NGOs, where we discussed a huge role that INTAC plays today. INTAC is a non-government organization at a national level. This sort of fills the gap between the nationally protected monuments and the state protected monuments. We have such immense treasure that is unprotected, and INTAC sort of looks at those. And today's session, the objective is to understand a few very important aspects of conservation. First being the authenticity and integrity, and then aim of conservation, and then conservation ethics. What is authenticity in conservation of historic buildings? Well, in general, authenticity or authentic, when we say, it means that something which is worthy of acceptance, something which is original. In fact, when we go back to Greek times or ancient Greek, they say authentic or authenticity is related to master, something that is produced by a master, which has that original quality or genius, genuine quality. So authenticity means measure of genuineness or credibility. However, concern of authenticity, its approach to restoration and conservation of historic buildings and monuments did not really begin until 19th century, where the quality of being authentic was important. Although its presence dates back to 1657, where it is mentioned in these four ways, like as being authoritative or duly authorized by a master or somebody who has produced it, and as being true in its substance, the originality of it, as being genuine and being real and actual. These were some of the things which did appear. However, the role of two important people in the Western context actually bring about a huge difference in clarifying what is authenticity with respect to conservation. We all would have heard at some point of life, the popular painter Raphael, who was from early 16th century. His significant role in conservation of earliest surviving monuments of Rome played a huge role. Along with him, in France, Eugene Viollet de Duke. He is also a very important personality who goes ahead and restores some of the historic buildings. And they felt at that time that it was very important to create awareness about systematic approach towards restoration and conservation of any ancient or historical buildings. That's when the context of redefining authenticity comes in. Heritage property and authenticity can be broadly looked at as two important values. That is memorable values, which dictates the age value of a property, historical value of a property, or the memorable or emotion related values, and present day values. When we try to protect these buildings or conserve these buildings, it must also accommodate the current intentions, right? The present day needs and requirements. So we look at more values in terms of use, functional values, and artistic or art values, and newness that it kind of brings into the current existing, built fabric. These are some of the values that we try to look at when we talk about authenticity. Now, three essential elements in any interventions relating to the conservation and restoration element of heritage preservation becomes very important. The first one is, any integration or any reintegration that we try to do when we are trying to conserve should be easily recognizable at close hand, of course. But at the same time, it should not adversely impact the unity that we are trying to bring in when we are doing restoration. I think some of the questions in the first session were on this, that how valid it is when we are trying to, restore something. We bring in new material and new things. I think the answer for which will be given in today's session in a way. And the second one is the role of material that directly results in the image. That should not be, irreplaceable. As in, so far the concept goes, if it does not really alter the structure, then it is still accepted. If it denotes the aspect of it, it is still valuable, even though the material is different and not the traditional material. For whatever reason, it may not be available in the current times. At times like this, then this is something that we need to understand. And the third being, any restoration should be made in such a way that it will not be an obstacle for subsequent future interventions. They should facilitate any other interventions for the future. So these are the three things. Now, these three things, again, take us back to the question that relate to understand the authenticity and integrity. While authenticity is a measure of genuineness or credibility, integrity is a measure of totality or completeness. We are more talking about the physical aspect of it. Like knowledge and understanding of these sources of information in relation to original and subsequent characteristics of any cultural heritage and their meaning are the requisite basis for assessing any of these, either the authenticity or the integrity. How much original remains, that is something that we need to look at, and how much remains to explain the heritage value. Whatever is remaining, is it enough to explain all the values and significance of that heritage property in that site? Is it satisfactory to whatever it stood in the original context? Probably original context is understood by some literary sources that we have. So when we tally these two, the site and the literary sources that we have, we will be able to kind of understand the situation. So what are the three things that it has to answer when we talk about authenticity and integrity? It is about wholeness. Are all the elements are there in the site to tell the story that we have known? And is the heritage site of sufficient size? Is the property of sufficient size to hold up to all the features and process that is necessary to convey its significance? And then intactness, about the condition of the property in relation to the threats to its existence and any risk in the environment surrounding the property. So despite the risks that surrounds the property, is it still intact enough and in a good size enough, in a wholeness or a complete enough for us to understand or derive these values that we want to understand? So such are the questions that we need to answer to identify the authenticity or integrity of any heritage property. So precisely to pin up three aspects of authenticity, that is authenticity of creativity and form. Is the form and the creativity as understood by us? Is it existing in the site as we understand it? And authenticity of material and history. Is the material and the history stands by? All of this, of course, you compare it with other sources of information and then you check on that. Authenticity in continuity of the socio-cultural context. So in the current socio-cultural context, how is it fitting? Or how is it situated? Meaning, is the location of that particular site exactly as discussed in the literature sources? So that is one check, whether the location is right or wrong. So that, for example, we fought for Ram Janmabhoomi, right? When we did that, we did do an intense research where we could get enough evidence showing that there was a temple earlier in that site. And when we look up the literary sources, they matched. And that's what, checks the authenticity of our claim. And the aspects of integrity is socio-cultural integrity, historical, structural integrity, and visual aesthetic integrity. So all of these three aspects in both are very important. And when we say integrity, it is not only in terms of physical fabric of the building, but also with respect to collective knowledge system and cultural landscape that it represents. So socio-functional cultural integrity. Properties include all elements that justify its significance. And it should not have suffered from any adverse effect of development or neglect. That is very, very important. Adverse effect as in, it should not be continued with the progress of the culture around or the physical fabric around. When we say visual integrity, the extent of visual impact of the property must be intact. So integrity actually refers to physical intactness as well as intangible aspects of any heritage property enough to identify its value. So let's try and understand this authenticity and integrity with respect to a example. Then probably the aspects are understood better. Let's look at an example of a temple in India, Sun Temple at Konark, Odisha. I think all of us would have seen the pictures of it, in our time. Some of you could have even visited this place. So this is Sun Temple. This is the grandest achievement of Odissan style of art and architecture, with its beautiful and incredible sculptures and ornamentation. And the size of these sculptures also varies from life size and also to few inches. We can find all of the sizes, magmon sizes. Though the temple was built in 13th century, it did not really catch the attention for conservation late up till 19th century. But let's see what you have on the visual. The first one is the sun god. This extant sculpture of sun god, it's on the north side of the sanctum sanctorium. Here what you see is the god is riding the horse, and if you notice carefully, he's wearing actually gumboots with devotees worshipping him and angels bringing garlands for him. So both sun god and his steed are highly ornamented, very ornamented and decorated. And you see the second picture is the Sun Temple complex with the remains of Nat Mantapa and then the Jagamohana that you see. And also you see a part of Gopura here. This is a panoramic view of the complex, and the scaffoldings that you see, they are erected around the Jagamohana. That is for restoration work. Actually, Ganga King Narasimhadeva built Sun Temple in 13th century at Konark, about 35 kilometers northeast to Puri, and this is a coastal line of Odisha actually. India with architectural style of Kalinga architecture. So if you have to understand the values of this temple, just by this much of information, you have not visited the site, but these are enough for you to determine certain values. They are very symbolic. Now, symbolism of freedom represents spiritual emancipation, and then sun god, by the virtue of the deity itself.
Actually, just a minute for interrupting. We can't see your presentation. We are seeing here some QBY recording. You please click on presentation once. Your PPT.
Should I represent it?
Yeah, please stop the presenting and then again start present.
Okay.
Mr. Sarang Arora, please not present to yourself. Mr. Sarang Arora.
I think somebody else is presenting.
Mr. Sarang Arora, please stop to present yourself. Otherwise I will remove you. Please stop your presentation. Okay, now you please start your presentation.
Yes, just a moment. So can you see it?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. May I know where
Yes, no problem. Yeah, it's okay. Sun Temple at Konark. This last one, symbolic values. It's okay.
Okay. So So we were talking about the symbolic values, and these are some of the values that we can determine when we look at the temple. Now, I will show you some of the visuals which are very, very beautiful, aesthetic and architectural, which denotes architectural value. So this is a landmark sculpture, this shows Odisha had ties with Africa. Actually, if you look closer to this, there is king holding a bow and arrow and he's seated on elephant and three traders who are dressed in long tunics, and that is an indication that they probably are Africans. They are gifting the king with giraffe. So this is trying to show what was happening during that time, so from which we can learn a lot about their trade here. And on the left you see there is a massive sculpture of Gajasimha, and this is made up of condylite stone, which is the local stone over there. And this was originally on the Vimana of Sanctum Sanctorium, and this was facing east. When Vimana collapsed, it fell on the adjacent Gopura of Jagamohana. Since then, it is they have just removed it from there and they have kept it within in the precinct itself. So these are some of the early pics which were taken before restoration, somewhere in 1868. And all these photos that I've been showing are all documented by ASI. Now, the temple exhibits a grand scale with a massive chariot that you can see mounted on 12 pairs of intricately carved Jain stone wheels. Each of these wheels are, very intricate and they're different. They're not really similar, with minor changes of decorations and things like that. And they are drawn by a set of 7 mighty stone horses, as though it is leading the sun god somewhere, the showing the some power of sun god. This is the masterpiece, you can say, creative genius in both the way it is conceptualized and realized. Temple represents all of this, movement across the heavens. That's what they say. So these 24 card wheels, each of it is about 3 meter in diameter and symbolize motives, and that kind of refers to cycle of seasons and months. So Sun Temple comprises several distinctive well organized spatial units also. If you go back and look at the temple in terms of its plan, it does conform to the temple typology at that time, that is in the 13th century. So these are some more visuals for you, just to understand the architectural details and the scale particularly. There are a lot of people here. This is just the plinth, the third picture that shows. So you can imagine the scale of the plinth itself and the gigantic sculptural scale you can imagine. So now we need to question all the 3 aspects that we were trying to understand with respect to authenticity. Whether are all the elements is telling the full story of the site, and then is it the scale of the project, of the heritage monument, is it big enough? Does it have all the features, and does it convey the significance that we are trying to understand, and the intactness? Of course, when we look at the 18th century photographs, it's really heartbreaking, and I cannot even imagine how they managed to do the restoration in such a way that these pictures are much better and they are more clearer. We are able to appreciate this much better. So ASI has done an immense restoration on this site. We'll discuss that also in some time, maybe in some other session. So here, these are the 3 questions that one need to ask, and I'm sure you'll be able to answer all of that. So the temple architecture and art as revealed, the conception, the scale, the proportion, and the whole sublime narrative, the entire temple, the way it is becoming visual narrative, the strength of its sculptural embellishment. So all of it justifies all the 3 aspects of authenticity and integrity. So let's look at the restoration part of it. So these were the 3 points we said has to be kept in mind when we are looking at any restoration. So what I want you to look at in the visual is there are these horses, and some horses have lost the body, some horses have lost the the hind legs and front legs and so on. So what they have tried to do here is they have only tried to retain the concept. That is just enough, like the ability to understand the value attributed to the heritage, and that depends on degree to which the information or the sources about the value may be understood or credible or truthfulness, for that matter. Here in the visual, horse is supported by stouts to maintain the concept of height. That's about it. They have not done anything else. They have not added the body, nor have they bought the same material and tried to carve some legs and try to fix it. They've not done that because it is structurally not really bothering the temple, but conceptually, yes, it is. To denote the height and to make sure that whatever the part is remaining stays intact, this is the step that is taken. So they are trying to match the color. The material is certainly different. Like we said, material becomes insignificant if they are trying to accommodate the concept and not really bother the structure. So restoration should not be an obstacle for the subsequent future intervention. So if you have to do anything else, anything in future, then it is very easy to remove these legs and do anything forward. So it is accommodating those options for future renovations as well. So such should be the restoration effort or conservation effort. Now let's move on to the next part, aim of conservation. Now, assessing heritage significance and value is important because developing instruments for assessing these values and significance are important because probably performance of conservation actions as such on any heritage sites, structures or cultural territories of landscapes, they become very crucial in the entire conservation process. Now, another question was asked to me in the previous session, how different is conservation and how different is renovation or restoration. Now, conservation is a process. It is the entire thing, the process of restoring it or reconstructing it and doing anything. So restoring, reconstruction and rehabilitation, all of these are methods of conservation. So to do that, we need to identify, that would be the task 1. And then what we need to do is, when we say identification, it is to elaborate on the values that we have identified and to write a statement of significance as in why it is significant. So you probably look at the typology, you probably look at who owns it, whether it is a community property or a national property, who owns it, and what are its values in terms of cultural significance. Could be for the community or could be for the nation itself. So that association and all the involvement in terms of community. So you do all of that to write, to list the values and then to write the statement of significance. So that after the task 1, then you move on to the next step. That would be to establish policy. Now, how do you do that? Integration of assessment and that has to be integrated with the values and significance, and you try to understand the policy which will help you to do that. That is a task 2, and that can be done in 2 ways: physical condition assessment and management context assessment. Now, when I say this, physical condition assessment meaning you try to understand the monument or the heritage property in its total physical condition. You try to document it as it is, and understand the condition, whether the structure is stable, or it requires some kind of a restoration, or whether it requires some kind of reconstruction activity at some part, whatever it is, that physical condition has to be assessed first. And then you have to also think about managing the context assessment. Suppose you do that, then what happens? What are its implications after the conservation? So how do you manage that post this? So that would be your second task. So the third task. Now here, you try to identify the indicators to decide the aim of conservation. Now the last one is the aim of conservation. How do you do that? The indicators will be all the values that you have already discerned and listed that links to the cultural heritage that. So cultural significance of each place or site is constantly being reformed due to these changing nature of values. Now, what do we mean by that? You have done so much of exercise and you have finally come to deciding about the aim of conservation. Now, if it's going to change, then what next? And that is what we call as post, that has to be determined prior to this. So, notion of conservation, we are talking so much about conservation. Are we really looking at something more tangible or physical, intangible, or whether we're talking about in terms of permanence or temporary? What is this? So, relevance of conserving any fabric varies from culture to culture. Now, some cultures prioritize non-material, values over the structural conservation of a fabric. Say, for example, this has led to two broad paradigms that has been there in the history, and that has triggered a lot of changes in the way we understand conservation now. So, the first one is the classical conservation theory. This was developed in the Europe in 19th century, where they considered that object has a value existing independently of people, that the materialistic value of a product is does not have anything to do with the emotions of people. The product is product, the structure is structure. So that is that has its own value in its own physical sense. So that should not be treated as any change. So that needs, when you take this stand, then there is a whole lot of different approach that you start thinking about in conservation. So it is more material centric and physical and tangible aspects that they value. However, the other theory, which was developed since 1980s, as a theory, yes, it was developed at that point with reference to the conservation. But as an idea or as a concept, it ever existed, especially in the southeastern regions. It was always there, which was more people centric and emotions and intangible aspects. See, the second one, this theory developed since 1980s, that viewed heritage is inevitably rooted more about people, as creators of this heritage. Who created this heritage? It is the people. So they are very much part of this heritage, who attributes meaning to them, and then they select what is to become of heritage from the past. So they said it is the people who has to be considered for conservation process. So the Eurocentric perspective was that it associated only with the tangible qualities rooted from origin of materialistic approach. The historical monuments which lied in, say, times of Christian or Greco-Roman tradition, it is more Western architecture or Western concept, I can say. The perfection of form is achieved through realistic visual forms. The Parthenon, for example, of Greek Athens, it's a picture perfect and the physically perfect, accuracy in terms of its construction and form was so much, that was their idea of heritage. So while Eastern architecture, more towards Japan, China, India, and all, so here we consider the physical form is only a means of transmitting the spiritual values. So for us, it is the intangible spiritual values which is represented through the physical form or the fabric. So I hope you understand the difference between the two. So they kind of dictate a very different approach in conservation. Let's look at a quick example to understand this better. Now, the tradition of conservation in Asia, that values as opposed to the Western concepts of conservation, they differ, like I said, because of the spiritual meaning of material culture. As they see it as a repository of for more as practices, skills, knowledge, spirituality that is more important, and that should be continued, renewed, and materials are very perishable as opposed to the notion of materials. This redefines the authenticity for us. So what is authentic per se here is not really the material, but probably the usage and the technique of the same material into the buildings. So let's look at a example of Shinto shrines. These are the buildings of Itsukushima Jinja. These are generally tradition of Japanese Shinto architecture, in which a mountain or a natural object becomes the focus of religious belief, and that to be worshipped from a shrine, generally constructed at the foot of the mountain. And what is the fact here is that it is in harmonious with the existence of nature around it. Now, Shinto shrines actually, they are the structures whose main purpose is to house or enshrine what they call it as kami, that is the spirits or holy powers. So that is intangible aspect. The kami is intangible, the shrine is tangible, and that is to house that. So its most important building is used for safeguarding or safekeeping the sacred objects and not really for the worship. So that is the concept or aspect of Shinto shrines. So here the island of Sito Island Sea, this has been holy place for Shintoism since earliest times. Now the first shrine building here were probably erected in 6th century, and the present shrine that dates back from 13th century. And this was actually built accurately, exactly reflecting the same structure which was there existing prior to it in the 12th century. With the same construction tile, exact replica, one can say, and was founded by most powerful leader of that time. So actually the entire scheme is redone, rebuilt. The practice is to rebuild. Whereas in the Western concept, the practice is to hold on to whatever is existing. So there's this very two different thing, like so these here Japanese spiritual life is deeply rooted in ancient Shintoism, which is centered on polytheistic nature worship. So they worship nature, mountains, water, the forests surrounded. So it is only symbolic that they provide clues to understand the aspect of Japanese religious expression. In fact, there is the practice is actually to build and then demolish it and reconstruct it exactly the same way. One other example, I think Ise, that has been that shrine actually is reconstructed every 20 years. So the entire, and they have a huge ritual and process which they do, or which they have, like, to reconstruct the whole of the structure in exactly the same way, in the same place, with a very similar material, that is wood. So they have a certain knowledge system, certain tradition, certain way they practice this, and that is acceptable. So these structures in per se are not permanent in that sense. They are permanent only for 20 years, and then the whole thing is redone. Now that practice is authentic for them. It is acceptable for them in their conservation. Now here the fabric is not conserved or continued actually. What is maintained is the tradition of construction and know-how. So rather than the material itself, the skill is treasured, the skill is continued, the skill is protected, preserved, conserved. It is a skill. Lots of rituals and process, which are all integral part of this entire exercise of rebuilding Shinto shrines. So essentially, what they believe is renewal of nature. Like, the tree sheds their leaves every winter, and again, they're full with fresh leaves in spring. The structures are also like that. So they worship nature, and they kind of relate their practices again to the nature. Now, the tradition of rebuilding shrines also is related to faith and philosophy that they adhere to. The custom is to reason ancient styles. They It is to replicate or represent the nature as it is, their own living heritage does. So what they when I was talking about the philosophy, or when I said philosophy, it means they follow Buddhism. Now, in Buddhism, the philosophy or the notion of permanence or impermanence relate to samsara. Like, nothing is permanent. We ourselves are not permanent. So everything is relative. So that the cycle of the wheel, the escape of the wheel is such that that it has to be renewed or innovated every time. So that the philosophy sort of is impressed on Japanese traditions, and also on Chinese traditions. Here also, you see the visual here. Many of the traditional wooden construction that happens in China, they also follow the same philosophy, and the structure is rebuilt every time. And that kind of concept or the philosophy also dictate in India also, but it is a little different. We see it as the science of happiness or prosperity, Vastu Shastra, which takes account to the cosmology or the nature in a different way. So here there is a concept called Jirnodharana, which we discussed in early session, which is derived from Jirna, means something that is decaying, and Uddharana means something to raise up. So hence it is about regeneration of the decay, meaning the building methods and architectural maintenance are derived from the traditional Hindu teaching of Vastu Shastra, which says that building is a living thing. Now, when we say building is a living thing, they compare it to the natural process or of the human body, where the human go through the same stages, right? The childhood, adolescence, and then old age, and then death or marana. So they compare that to the building. So building also go through that. It is young and fresh, and then it ages, and then it becomes old, and finally, it will become the idea here of restoring or innovating, and the maintenance directly relates to restoring or restoration. And here again, when we talk about Vastu Shastra, we are trying to restore the spirit of any dwelling unit or a temple or any heritage place. So it is the spirit that we are trying to focus on, not really the outer shell. When we redo the outer shell, the spirit also is energized. That's the idea. Now let's look at another example This is Angkor Wat, which is a cultural, World Heritage site. Here, we are talking about what needs to be conserved, aim of conservation, right? So let's look at this example in a little different light. Um, how do you determine the authenticity or integrity or values? How do you define that in such a case? Now, Angkor is one of the most important archaeological sites in the Southeast Asia. This stretches about 400 kilometers, and it includes a large area of forest. It is it has archaeological parks that contains magnificent remains of different capitals of Kempfer Empire. Many sites which has these heritage value. Uh, it is from 9th to 15th century. Now they include the famous temple of Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom, which we are all very popular with, and Bayon Temple as well. So these are countless sculptures, decorations which are spread across all over the site. And another important aspect is that this is also inhabited by many villages, and many of them, their ancestors date back from Angkor period time, like from 19th or 15th century. So they can trace back their legacy or ancestral lane to that back. So people are direct descendants of what we talk about as history or ancient ancestors per se. So now, what do you want to conserve in this? Do you want to conserve the historical and aesthetic value of this in its most physical sense? Because it has connection with the Chola rulers of Tamil Nadu, of India. Between 10th and 11th century, when Rajaraja Chola or Rajendra Chola, his son, both of them had a direct relationship with this Cambodia, where they're not only the trade, but also in terms of relationship, they had relationship beyond trade. So it determines the historic value of this site or of this temples. So temple is a part of larger system of settlement. Now this versus living values of site and spiritual and social values that is existing even today. There are people who, monks particularly, this is a center for those monks who consider this place as sacred, and it is a spiritual center for them, and they are living here in the site, and they have certain practices, certain way of living with these heritage property or heritage temple. So how do you sort of decide whether to look at only the physical part of it, or to look at the intangible aspects and the people part of it? So it's left to you how you want to understand it, because we have had discussion throughout the session about this, so I'll just leave it open for you guys to decide on that. So now let's look at the third part, which is third aspect, which is also very important in the whole process of conservation. Now we're talking about ethics that we need to follow. Now, we all know evidences of the past knowledge that kind of gives us the means by which these are transmitted into the future. Now that's where the conservation comes, right? We see how to pass this particular heritage in its tangible manifestation or intangible manifestation. How do we pass this on to the future? Now, when we talk more about the tangible part, we look at scientific foundation based on the rationalistic approach. Meaning, we want to do it in a most systematic and scientific way. We preserve or conserve it in such a way that it stays, it actually extends the life of the cultural property as much as possible, so it stays in a good shape to be given for the next generation. So for this, how do we do this? And that's where the code of ethics come into picture. Now, genesis of conservation ethics, if we take as a recommendation or as a systematic approach, it did come little late, though the concepts always existed. In early 18th century, John Ruskin from England, um, he tries to understand the conservation ethics based on age and value and entity of feeling. So here, the early 20th century, it actually saw development of more analytical approach towards the conservation and restoration of all these historic heritage that we had. And actually two names stands out theoretically when we look at um, John Ruskin and also Gustav Govunto. Now, Gustav is from Italy. Uh, let's see their view. John Ruskin actually identifies this, and that kind of gives us a concept of how a bond is created between the conservator and the conserved. Conserved here means the object or the heritage entity that we're looking at. It could be a building, site, or a product or a province which has come from you, from the ancestors to you in the family, whatever it is. So in 1900s, when he emphasized material and substance, so it is material and substance which is more important than anything else. However, when Gustav put forth his ideas, he highlighted or he emphasized on evidence and methodology. As in, what is important is all right, but how do you precisely hold on to it or conserve it? So it is the evidence which is there and the methodology which is more significant in conservation process. So these were some of the two distinctive ideologies which kind of led to conservation ethics. Further, in terms of doctrine or documents, this had its and only after the World War II. Official bodies were created that time to codify a set of values. Now, Charter of Athens and Charter of Venice, they are the early charters which are very, very significant. Then, and they kind of laid or formulated codes in order to create a common ground, and guiding rules for conservation was set across. So, some of the rules, let's just quickly run through. Now, the condition of a building before any intervention and all methods and material used during treatment and post treatment must be fully documented. So, they stressed or emphasized on documentation prior and post both. What does that mean? That means you need to do a condition mapping. Remember, we just spoke about assessing the physical condition. That's what it means. And then historic evidence must not be destroyed or falsified or removed. So if you have any historic evidence, just to make sure that it is aesthetically done good, you should not destroy that, or you should not falsify that. You should be very cautious of holding on to whatever evidence is there and not destroy it. This is one of the important ethics that needs to be followed. And any intervention must be very minimum and only whatever is necessary. Now, when we were looking at the horses in Konark Temple, the intervention was very minimum. It is just one pole that they kind of supported just to signify the concept of height. When you look at it, you realize the height very clearly. Otherwise, there is nothing for you to scale the height. So it's just a concept which is tried to restore and not really the structure. So intervention is very, very minimum. And intervention must be governed by staunch respect for the aesthetics. So when they did that also, the pole or whatever, they did not change the color or the texture of it. They tried to put it in such a way that it kind of became an extended part of the horse itself, as though we're only seeing the bone without the flesh. I'm just telling. So historical and physical integrity of cultural property. So you need to show the respect for the age of the heritage that you're trying to look at. And then any proposed intervention should be reversible if technically not possible. So like I mentioned before also, the restoration should look at something that opens up for future activities or restoration further. Now you have another important person whom we'll talk about briefly tomorrow, Bernard. He also comes up with a couple of ethic rules. So to allow maximum amount of existing material to be retained. So you should not discard any of the material, even if you cannot identify what that piece is or whatever it is. You may not be really able to identify it, but you should not dispose it off. You should retain it. And even while restoring, you should not replace new things, but have the thing which are already existing and try to build onto it, add onto it in a very harmonious way. So in color, tone, texture, form, scale, in every other way. Any proposed intervention should not be taken by conservator or restorers who are not really trained, who have insufficient knowledge or experience about handling such projects. They unless they're obtained competent advice. So if there is somebody to guide them to do so, they should not take up such activities. So you and me cannot, unless we obtain some advice from a scholar or somebody who is experienced, even though if you want to do something, it is not possible. So we need to put it across to the right body, and that was the relevance of yesterday's session that we had. So for example, here the Gopuram, we know that the evidences clearly point out that Gajasimha was something that which stood on the Gopuram, but they did not try to put it back. What they did, it is fallen and it is in that state. They just made sure that it is there in the precinct and does not go back, because we really don't know how it was. We don't have the clarity as in terms of how it looked. We just know it was there and was facing east, but the information is not complete for us to do that. And the other one is about the legs. So not necessary to fill it up as long as it can be preserved with minimum intervention. So these are some of the ethics that one should follow. Now let's just take one last example to understand that. Now Ashokan pillar at Sarnath was rediscovered in 1905. These are some of the pictures, early pictures that you see. And these are some of the latest pictures that you can see. Now, here again, you see the difference. The site is restored or sort of, put them all together, but in such a way that nothing is lost, everything is preserved, but in a way that they stay as it is. For example, if you notice in the, the picture above, you see the broken column, and just below that you see the broken column, how it is preserved today. So it's just put it secured, that's all. There is a security given to it that it does not get lost or does not wither anymore to the climatic conditions. So this is how it is kind of protected. The stupa here, this is a huge scale, about 30-meter high, and this is actually significant because it is more than 2000 years, and it is supposed to be where Buddha said to have preached his first sermon, and that's why this becomes very important historically. So I think that's the end of the session. We'll look at a assignment quickly. Assignment is identify any heritage site nearby and try to establish authenticity either with its tangible part or with its intangible part, whatever is applicable to your identified heritage site. If you were to suggest conservation a solution, or based on authenticity and integrity that you derive, then write about it very briefly. Now you can also take the same example that you would have chosen on the first day. I said you can identify any heritage site in the neighborhood or close by in the precinct. It may be protected, may not be protected. Even for that, you can do this exercise. Actually, it is a sequence. If you identify something in the for the first day's class, you can apply all the assignments to the same example. So that way, you will understand the process of conservation, and that's the intention actually. So I hope you understood the assignment, and I really urge all of you to try doing this. Um, I think this will really help you when you do this assignment. Anyway, so I think I'm at the end of the session. Thank you.
थैंक्स अ लॉट। बहुत ही अच्छा रहा सेशन और समझने में भी हमें काफी अच्छी तरह से ये रहा, और आपने कुछ बहुत अच्छे एग्जांपल्स दिए, जिसने आपने शिंटो श्राइन्स के बारे में बताया, जो लोग इतना मास्टरी रखे हुए हैं कि उसको रिबिल्ड करने के लिए अपना ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज को वो आज भी यूज कर रहे हैं। सो रियली रियली वंडरफुल। इस तरह से कुछ ही जगह पर आज भारत में हमें ये नॉलेज दिखाई देता है, particularly some in Karnataka, Odisha, and somewhere in the as I know
West
in
Bengal, West Bengal also.
Yes, yeah. In India, in Gujarat and Rajasthan, that people उनको एक particular नाम दिया है कि जो मंदिरों का ये पुनः ये करते हैं as it is। तो मेरे दिमाग से भी वो नाम निकल गया। मैं हमेशा उनसे परिचित भी रहता हूँ। वो रेड सैंडस्टोन का ज्यादा वर्क करते हैं। हमने कुछ सौराष्ट्र और कुछ कच्छ भुज के कुछ टेम्पल्स, कोठारा वगैरह वहाँ के टेम्पल्स का वर्क किया था। उस समय उन लोगों ने भी बहुत अच्छा ही किया, क्योंकि हम ये कहते हैं हमारा जो थियोरेटिकल नॉलेज है उससे उनका प्रैक्टिकली ट्रेडिशनल जो नॉलेज उनके पास है, इट्स रियली अमेजिंग। क्योंकि हम कहते हैं कि इसमें इतना ये मिलाना है चाहिए, इतना ये मिलाना चाहिए, बट हम जो कहें उससे मैं हमेशा ये कहता हूँ, वो लोग जो कहते हैं वो ज्यादा परफेक्ट रहता है। क्योंकि वो कहते हैं ना कि एक बार आईसाइट तैयार हो जाता है, देखने से उनको वो ज्यादा नॉलेज हो जाता है। तो ये सही बात है। तो अगर किसी का कोई सवाल है, एक हाथ रेज किया था दृष्टि जी ने, वो शायद हाँ दिव्या जी ने। यस प्लीज।
Namaste, Mahodaya. No, actually, I got the answer further when she started explaining. But I have another question for Sindhu Bhagini ji. Sindhu ji, we talked about Angkor Wat, and similarly, we have lot of heritage monuments across Asia and also Middle East, which is related to the kingdoms that were part of Bharat before. Right.
Correct.
So I want to understand how and far can we, because now we have international boundaries, right? So how geographically can Bharat's, ASI organizations like that, can they intervene because it once belonged to, was a part of Bharat or something like that, or shouldn't we? How is the legality aspect of it? Is it related to that country, or can we also like intervene and try to join hands with them? Does ASI also do that?
Yeah, I think I have your answer tomorrow. I mean, that's the discussion. As in,
one example, Angkor Wat, ASI helped there completely.
Correct.
Okay.
We have international organizations which actually take forward this. When we are under that international organization, then there is no boundary. Internationally, we can participate. In fact, of course, I will explain this with a wonderful example tomorrow. How the World Heritage Sites, so-called, can have the benefit of this. Being World Heritage Site, that it can get help from anywhere across the world. It doesn't have to be from their own place. Probably we may have the knowledge, but may not be having the technical, aspects right. So we can ask help of some other country which has that to restore our heritage. This is something we'll discuss tomorrow in detail. I think I'll have the answer to you tomorrow with an example.
One book by Archaeological Survey of India published regarding this Ta Prohom Temple, a conservation strategy. this book is here. And this is completely regarding that Cambodian temples only.
Yes.
किस तरह से उन्होंने कंजर्वेशन किया, ASI का क्या रोल उसमें रहा. It's a wonderful book. The Prohom Temple, a conservation strategy. Archaeological Survey of India published this book.
Shayad
So you
you can message it in the group.
Yes, I will message it. Book name and writer, published by ASI and publication. Yeah, I will message it. No problem.
Dhanyawad.
Taprop complex, they have office. Our office is there,
Yes,
because
yeah,
we
yeah.
are conserving that. So they have been there in that office and on
wonderful.
that campus. I have seen it. Yeah.
Nice.
Hello, Sindhuji. I have one more question. Like you said, we should not harm the originality of a structure while conserving or restoring a heritage building, monument, isn't it? But this is the code of ethics for the people who are restoring or conserving that. But how about the public who go and spoil? See, we have a lot of people in India who go and spoil the structure of the already restored, already conserved monuments.
Exactly.
Right? So are they, I mean, do we have like, is it punishable act to do that, or how is it monitored after restoration also? Is it monitored so that it is not harmed further? Do we have like, is it a punishable act? Because we also have a lot of nowadays I read a lot of leftist reports that in Tamil Nadu especially, some people who are Hindu phobic are painting the Sanskrit inscriptions on the ancient Hindu temples because they want to show that Tamil language is older than Sanskrit, something like that, you know. They're spoiling actually, which is already restored. So how is there any measure legally or from ASI where we could also monitor that this is not spoiled further?
Yes. See, again, you know, I will discuss the same exact issue with other examples in my one more session, actually. There are, you know, rules and all of that is there. But then, you know, when we get to know that something is happening, and that is where the problem is. We get to know about it once it is done, unfortunately, and then we won't get our hands on the actual culprits. That is always there, and that is the reason why, you know, the entire purpose of this course is that to bring in the awareness to everybody as citizens. If we are aware of our own heritage and properties, then we become the local guardians and we protect, we make sure that we don't become the culprits such as them, and we don't do that. Actually, if you go to many tourist places, you will see, you know, people would have carved their names on every wall. It is so unfortunate and heartbreaking to see that. You know, that has to come from within, and that is what we need to, you know, urge our younger generation to take it up as their responsibility to respect and appreciate the heritage that we have. If we do that, only then we can pass it on to our next generation. I think that's the only way we can avoid this. But otherwise, yes, there are a lot of policing and protections and security given by the bodies like Intact and ASI. ASI is doing an immense work. But despite all that, I will discuss one of the case which happened very recently in Karnataka and in the following session. And that is where the real concern lies, you know. We have a lot of things in order, yet we don't have many things in order. So that's where we cautiously need to bridge that gap by being ourselves responsible for our heritage. So every citizen should have that. Only then that is possible. Otherwise, it is difficult. But yes, I have a couple of examples to discuss this in future session.
So in our next session, we will take the more information, and we will share also some more information if we have. I request to all of you that अगर आपके पास भी इस तरह की कुछ जानकारी है जैसे अभी दिव्या जी ने बताई, तो कृपया उसे WhatsApp पे शेयर कीजिए ताकि हम उसको नोटिंग कर सके और ज्यादा से ज्यादा जो है उसके बारे में अवेयरनेस भी हम निर्माण कर सके. सो बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया, बहुत ही अच्छा सेशन रहा आज का. If there are any more questions, then you can please send it on WhatsApp also. So with the kind permission of Sindhu ji, अगर परमिशन है तो हम आज का सेशन यहाँ पर रोकते हैं.
Sure, sir, sure. धन्यवाद.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
धन्यवाद.